Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Rolka. I want to thank you for checking out my video. I've been very fond of the questions from comments segment that I started recently, and this is another installment of that. I got a question, and I felt like it comes up so frequently in so many different ways that I just wanted to jump on it as soon as I got it. So let me read the question, and then we're going to dive into it. And just to give you an overview, this is about confusion amongst terms used in singing and the teaching of singing. So the question reads, well, first of all, for what I'm about to say, thank you very much. Very much enjoy your ideas on singing technique and performance. So thank you for that. I think I know what you mean when you speak of micro adjustments, tiny adjustments to singing or phonation. And these are best done out of creating a proper singing environment by having good engagement and airflow and cultivating release of the vocal mechanism so that it can adjust along the way, mostly in response to what you hear. Good and balanced sounds at different parts of the register seem to need different ways of production. Indeed. In my readings, I've come across the terms or ideas of open, closed, and covered singing. Even with suggested, and then they've crossed this out but never demonstrated, examples of each, I find I'm unsure of what is meant when these terms or ways of singing are spoken of. Can you address this? Yes. The use of classic Italian-style descriptors, voce aperta, voce chiusa, voce coperta, and then the idea of open and closed vowels only add to my confusion. If this is too lone a topic to address, reference to the literature, and they've written ha there, would also be worthwhile for me, best as always. So this just comes up so frequently, and the big picture item here is that singing instructors don't even always use these terms to mean the same things, and especially when you combine the classic teachings and the classic writings in the bel canto literature versus what can get talked about in popular singing instructor terms and terminologies and things like that. Not to say that there's always consensus with the classical realm, but it just goes back and forth to mean different things, and it gets very confusing. So I'm going to tackle a few of these terms here, but in truth, coming to an understanding of the terms and how it impacts your phonation will be the best help for you. And then also, if you're working with an instructor or you're watching someone such as me online, trying to work with your voice and come to an understanding of what they're expecting of you, trying to come to an understanding of how they understand that language will also help you too. Now, in terms of referencing literature, there's two books that I think are particularly helpful, and they are helpful in that he often talks in both terms, even though the way that he's using both of those terms sometimes differs from the way that other people use them. So anyways, the first one that I would recommend, which I'm recommending it primarily because it's pretty comprehensive, it is applicable across Fox. So, basically a soprano vocalist could use this just as much as a bass baritone because it deals somewhat in general principles of singing. It is The Structure of Singing by Richard Miller. I'm also recommending this because it's relatively inexpensive compared to some of the other texts that are out there by Richard Miller. And if you use the links that are in the description of the video, they will take you to my Amazon influencer page, and there's a link to this book there. But in truth, this is the book that I would recommend you try to find a copy of. It's out of print. For some reason, it hasn't gone back in print, even though some of the other books have. It's kind of silly how much this tiny little book costs. I've seen it as high as $300. I've seen it as low recently as $80. That's still expensive, but it really does break down the terms, I think, in a very useful way, in a very comprehensive way. It is filled with technical language, so, know that getting into it, basically, that you may end up having to look up even more of the terms in order to understand what it is the author, Richard Miller, is trying to convey to you. But it was this book that really helped me to come to a firm understanding of the mechanics of singing and how to go about working on things. It really changed everything about the way that I think about singing and the pedagogy behind it. It is rooted in bel canto singing technique, yet it is a somewhat more technical application of it, in my opinion. Now, looking at the language here, closed, open, and covered. Now let's take these one at a time. First, open. Open singing, voce aperta. Definition: unskillful singing, lacking in proper resonance balance. But of course, we're told to open up all the time. So right off the bat, that term gets used to mean unskillful singing. There is no balance or alignment between the vowels. This would contradict with the notion of opening as we ascend across the zona de passaggio, where we can frequently be told to open up or increase the airflow. Again, it depends on to whom you're speaking as to whether or not you want to open or not, as the case may be. Closed singing, on the other hand, in this text, is used to refer to balanced singing. This is consistent with my use of the word narrow. However, that balance changes depending on where you are in the register of your voice. So down here, closed singing, narrow vowels. That is appropriate for the range of my voice. As I ascend, however, into my zona de passaggio, where I'm beginning to make adjustments to my voice in order to facilitate a smooth transition across the secondo passaggio, those vowels are narrow still, even though they are different from what I sang before. It is the balance that we are looking for, the balance between, Richard Miller refers to it between dark and light, so it's neither too light, too brilliant, too nasal, too that, nor is it too far back, too weighty with the heavy vocal mechanism being the thyroarytenoid dominant singing voice, the chest voice muscles. It's about balance, and we use these terms to kind of try to convey that, but admittedly it gets confusing because they get used differently in different schools of thought, by different people, and by their own individual understandings of the meanings of these terms. Also, covered singing, and this one I think is perhaps the most challenging, in that there are at least 3 different definitions for the usage of the term covered as it refers to the teaching or the execution of singing. When Richard Miller is talking about it, he is in fact talking about those micro adjustments that we make throughout the zona de passaggio and over the secondo passaggio in order to create consistent tone quality. So were I to continue to mount the scale and ascend to the secondo passaggio, I'm continuing to allow my voice to make adjustments as I go, I started below my secondo passaggio, I sang up to it and beyond it, but those vowels are subtly changing all the way through it. If I've done this well, the point of transition between my chest voice and head voice at the secondo passaggio will be effectively masked. You will not hear it as a dramatic change in tone quality compared to if I had voce aperta open and I was unskillful in this. Where the changeover is quite obvious. Now that often gets referred to as changing from chest voice to falsetto. And in truth, that's kind of accurate in that the range that I'm singing above my secondo passaggio, I am using a falsetto tone production, but that too is confusing because falsetto is also a range of our voices, which for the male tenor starts around B4. There. But if we have unskillfully navigated the secondo passaggio, we'll get that separation of the vocal folds, that air bleeding over, that abduction, separation of the vocal fold. It's not closed. It is unskillfully done by some accounts. Don't mean to be judgmental. And so all of these things start to get confusing because we're just using the same term to mean different things. Moving on from our covered voice. So covering, when done skillfully, results in that nice, consistent changeover. Covering also refers to the changing of the vowel sounds as we make our way through the zona di passaggio. We might say that we are covering. We are changing the vowels. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about vowel modifications. But covering has also been used to refer to what is an older vocal practice called legit singing. And in legit singing, there was a very predominant use of the heavy mechanism in covering, and so it had a certain affectation to it. As I get into my zona di passaggio, it'll become apparent. You can hear there's a certain dull quality to it. And that has come to mean covered as well. My hope here is that I haven't created more confusion. And if I have, please leave your comments or questions in the comments for this video. The main takeaway, if I could instill one thought here, is that there is no consensus, I'm afraid to say. We don't have consensus. The bel canto practitioners may do, but in practical terms, when it gets used by individual vocal instructors, and this is my experience, so your experience may vary, but in my experience, different singing instructors, different pedagogues will use these terms differently. And unfortunately, that creates confusion. My advice is to listen carefully, listen for consistency in either the context, like whatever context you're learning it in, whether it's a video or you're working with an instructor or you're reading it in a book. Try to understand a bit about where that resource is coming from so that you will at least have a starting point for the historical precedents that may be driving the use of those terms. And as always, ask questions. Like if it's a video, then you can leave a comment asking a question. What do you mean by open? What do you mean by closed? If it's a teacher, ask. If it's me, ask as you have done. And hopefully I can shed some light on the meanings of the terms. Finally, And then the idea of open and closed vowels only add to my confusion. Yet again, we have this additional layer of the use of the terms open and closed, and this time as it relates to vowels. This is still somewhat separate from what I've discussed thus far, and as succinctly as I can be, we often talk about vowels in terms of narrow or open, or closed or open, or narrow and wide. And when we talk about those vowels, we are speaking of them as they are typically spoken in the spoken voice, not the singing voice. So when I say that E is a narrow vowel, I am referring to E and its narrowness as it would typically be spoken. It is something to consider that depending on the native language of the individual in question, that will change. So even that's not a hard and fast rule. We talk about it in those terms in the speaking voice because in vowel alignment, when we've got our vowels aligned properly, the narrowness or width of the vowel is, and when I'm referring to it there, I'm talking about vowel modification. So we could also talk about it in terms of pureness. The E in that range of my voice is fairly similar to the E in my speaking voice in its sound. But in truth, it is slightly adjusted in order to align with the other vowels, particularly the wider vowels. Again, speaking of them as it refers to the speaking voice, ah and o tend to feel and be pronounced wider in the speaking voice. But in the singing voice, we adjust them so that they are all in alignment. And as we mount the scales and go into the zona de passaggio, they are all modified in subtle ways in order to facilitate consistent tone quality production as we continue to mount the scale and ascend over the secondo passaggio. So I hope this helps. These are confusing terms. Again, if there's something that needs clarification, please ask a question in the comments or find me on Twitter. I really appreciate the questions. Thank you so much for watching. Take really good care of your voices. Enjoy singing, and hopefully we'll see you again. Bye.